Hey, it's Mrs. Baranyk. This is the 7th video in my series covering world history before 1200. In the classical era, I've covered the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans, so let's talk a little bit about the empires of South Asia, which mostly affect the modern countries of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, and Afghanistan. South Asia is geographically and culturally diverse. Did you know there are 780 languages spoken in India today? Yeah, that's a lot. The first empire in Indian history was the Mauryan Empire, which you see on the map in purple. It lasted for about 140 years. Some people say that the founder, Chandragupta Maurya, was inspired by Alexander the Great, whose brief empire extended into South Asia, but who knows? He certainly conquered the satraps left in western India by Alexander the Great. Remember them from the Persian Empire? And other remnants of Alexander's Hellenistic Empire. The Mauryans were conquerors, but they also used Hinduism to unite people. Hinduism has a pantheon of around 33 million gods. Partially, this is because of the Mauryans. As they conquered, they incorporated conquered people's gods into Hinduism, explaining that they were part of the religion all along. This made for an easier transition to Mauryan rule, as they didn't have to give up their religion. This also led to Hinduism not having a single dogma. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are central texts for Hinduism, primarily the Vedas, and they establish common practices and beliefs, but there are also differences in how it's done depending upon where on India you're from. At its peak, there were 50 to 60 million people living under Mauryan rule, which is close to the population of the Roman Empire at its peak. To help keep control over its large and diverse population, the empire was divided into 4 provinces. They had a well-organized bureaucracy and civil service where non-royal people helped to run the government, and one of the largest armies of their time. They even had 9,000 war elephants. The Romans also used war elephants. They were like the tanks of the ancient world. The Mauryans also created a single currency system for South Asia, which really got trade flowing. The Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans all created their own coin-based currencies too. Taxes were collected by the imperial government and generally accepted as fair, although later in the empire's reign they caused major dissent as they were way too high. And the Mauryans also built the Grand Trunk Road, connecting the western and eastern halves of northern India, which became part of, you'll never guess, the Silk Road. Greek and Hellenistic kingdoms were important trade partners for the Mauryans. They also traded into Southeast Asia, which eventually spread Hinduism there as well. One of the best leaders of the Mauryan Empire was Ashoka, who after a particularly bloody battle decided to become a Buddhist. Buddhism was more nonviolent than Hinduism, and one of its central motivations is the stopping of suffering. Ashoka's reign led to Buddhism spreading widely in India. He and his son sent out Buddhist missionaries and spread Buddhism to Central Asia and Sri Lanka. After Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire went into decline due to weaker leaders, and for about 400 years, India went back to being decentralized with many small kingdoms instead of being centralized under a single leader. During this time, there were some kingdoms that rose to prominence, like the Buddhist Kushan Empire that ruled the northern part of South Asia from the 1st century through the 3rd century CE. They had extensive trade relationships with the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty in China, but most of what we know about them comes from China, as they left very little textual evidence behind. In the late 3rd or early 4th century, a new empire emerged in South Asia, but it was smaller than the Mauryans. This was the Gupta Empire. The thing that most people talk about with the Guptas is that it was a golden age for South Asia. A golden age occurs when people are wealthy, peaceful, creative, and innovative. One of the most famous poets of Indian history, Kalidasa, lived during this time. He is frequently called the Shakespeare of India, and his most famous play, Shakuntala, is still performed. Their monumental architecture was also amazing. They literally carved temples out of rock. Scientific and medical studies were also quite advanced during this time period. Gupta scientists created a solar calendar much like our own when everybody else was using lunar calendars, and they had come to believe that the Earth traveled around the sun, which the West wouldn't figure out until the 16th century. And you know the numbers we use today that are called Arabic numbers? Well, or numerals, they're actually South Asian. The Arabs learned them from South Asia and taught them to the Europeans. They also created the concept of zero and the decimal system, and for those of you who love Pi Day, let's thank the scientists of the Gupta Empire. But that's not even it. Their doctors recorded hundreds of diseases and cures. They did some plastic surgery. They were giving vaccines. Their doctors were the best in the world at this time. And like all the others, in order to keep control of their empire, they were highly bureaucratic. They also brought back Hinduism. While it wasn't forced on the population, the Guptas used Sanskrit, the holy language of Hinduism, as their official language of empire. They also sponsored poets like Kalidasa, who wrote in Sanskrit. This brought about a resurgence of Hinduism, and of course, like other empires, their military was awesome, and they were actively involved in trade. The Grand Trunk Road was kind of like the middle of the Silk Road. Along it were rest stops called caravanserai, where merchants would rest, but they also met up to trade. The fall of the Guptas came around the same time that many other empires began to falter. This was largely due to weak leadership and an invasion by the Huns, who were also busy attacking the Romans, the Chinese, etc. These invasions also led to further decline of Buddhism in India as centers of Buddhist learning were destroyed and because many monasteries were attacked for their wealth. By the 6th century, the Gupta Empire was again replaced by smaller kingdoms. In video 8, I'll be talking about classical China.